Hi, I'm Chris Green, Director of the Loyal Jones Appalachian Center at Berea College. Welcome to our Weatherford Award Winners Reading Series. The Weatherford Awards are given each year by Berea College and the Appalachian Studies Association. The Weatherford Awards honor books that best illuminate the challenges, personalities, and unique qualities of the Appalachian South. The three categories recognized are fiction, poetry, and nonfiction. This award commemorates the life and achievements of W.D. Weatherford Sr., who was a pioneer and leading figure for many years in Appalachian development, youth work, and race relations. Today, we are celebrating the 2020 winner for the Weatherford Award in Nonfiction, Appalachia of Reckoning, A Region Responds to Hillbilly Elegy, edited by Anthony Harkins and Meredith McCarroll. After I introduce them, they will provide an overview of the book, share a favorite passage or two, and then the three of us will have a conversation. Hi, guys.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. So Tony Harkins is professor of history at Western Kentucky University in Bowling Green and a scholar of U.S. popular cultural history, particularly of Appalachia and rural America. He is also author of Hillbilly, A Cultural History of an American Icon. At WKU, he teaches courses in 20th century US history, American popular culture, and American studies. And I also recently learned that he's serving on the Kentucky Oral History Commission. Meredith McCarroll is director of writing at, how do I say it, Meredith?
Bowdoin College.
Bowdoin College, where she teaches courses in writing, Southern American literature, and film. Author of Unwhite, Appalachia, Race and Film, McCarroll earned degrees from Appalachian State University, Simon's College, and the University of Tennessee. She grew up in Western North Carolina and now lives in Portland, Maine with her partner and their two sons. Okay, guys, I'm switching it now and I give it over to you.
Well, thanks, Chris. It's wonderful to be here and to be speaking to you about our book. And I thought I would start with just giving a sort of synopsis of the book, reading from the intro to our book, which is called Why This Book? So this is a book born out of frustration. This is a book born out of hope. It attempts to speak for no one and to give voice to many. This is a book that could have emerged without Hillbilly Elegy, but it was also created in the explicit context of a post-election, post-Hillbilly Elegy moment. It therefore attempts to respond to those who have felt they understand Appalachia now that they've read Hillbilly Elegy, or by now seen the film, and to push back against and complicate those understandings. It is meant to open a conversation about why that book struck such a deep nerve with many in the region, but it is not meant to demonize J.D. Vance. Instead, the contributors to this book prioritize focusing on the region, reclaiming some of the talk about Appalachia, and offering ideas through the voices of many who have deep, if varied, lived experiences in and of Appalachia. Appalachian Reckoning provides a platform for reactions to and insights about Vance's book and its reception, but also to writings that reach well beyond Hillbilly Elegy, to consider the many ways that Appalachians experience their Appalachianness. Some contributors emphasize the need to challenge distorting and debilitating stereotypes. Some stress the need to face the region's problems forthrightly and squarely. Some are quiet and contemplative. Others are angry. Yet despite what the majority of our contributors find to be Hillbilly Elegy's flaws and even damages, they share the sense that the broader public rediscovery of the region, that Hillbilly Elegy, and the reconstruction of the region that Dwight Billings dubs Trumpalachia, the ways this have engendered new ways of thinking about the region are also an opportunity, a chance to reclaim Appalachia and to help those unfamiliar with the region to recognize its complexities and its diversity. Now, among the pressing questions the book raises in its many different forms are what about Vance and his book accounts for the explosion of interest in Appalachia and its people in this historical moment of national political turmoil. Why have the ideas in hillbilly elegy caused such a firestorm in the region? What can we learn about both actual Appalachia and the way it is perceived from these reactions and debates? What does it mean in the 21st century to be Appalachian? And perhaps most significantly, as our poet Jeff Mann asks in his poem in the book, Social Capital, what other Appalachian voices have been drowned out in the flood of attention that Vance and his book have garnered, and how can these voices be heard? Together, the scholarship, personal reflections, poetry, and photography in Appalachian Reckoning offer a rejoinder to the national reporting on Appalachia that is rooted in the hillbilly elegy phenomenon and that defines the region monochromatically and almost completely in terms of backwardness, ignorance, isolation, violence, dependency, passivity, and ultimately as a place of social, economic, and cultural death. This book instead presents a very different Appalachia and Appalachians, a place and people with undeniable problems, but also intellectual vitality, diversity, be it ideological, gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, and a powerful resilience. There is a space for all of us to reclaim Appalachia as it is for us. And there is a desperate need for the fierce hope embedded in these grounded critiques, humorous anecdotes, and captured moments. We hope this book inspires a fierce hope for Appalachia. Thanks.
So I can read a little bit now from my contribution to the book. And Tony offered in the excerpt from the introduction an overview that we can maybe return to in our conversation after I read a bit. But what was exciting about this project for, I think, many people was the ways that we brought together scholarship and narrative, poetry, photography. We were excited about what could happen when we brought a lot of different forms of writing in. And so my piece is a narrative piece that I had previously published in Southern Cultures, and it is called On and On, Appalachian Accent and Academic Power. Let's go around the room and say where we're from. It was my first day in a class called Experiencing Appalachia during my first year of college. Raleigh, someone said. Just outside of Charlotte, said another. High Point. The professor continually nodded as the circle made its way to me. Haywood County, I said, her eyebrows raised in respect. My home was only about 100 winding miles from the classroom in which I was sitting, but Haywood County suddenly became more than a place to me. It was a marker of identity. On day one in class, I learned that the region's boundaries have been constantly contested. I was told that migratory patterns could explain some of the dialects of the mountains, and I came to understand that I was Appalachian. Now, I knew that I was a mountain girl. My family had been in Haywood County for generations, and one branch of my family tree started or stopped, depending on your perspective, when the Cherokee were marched through. But I had to take a class called Experiencing Appalachia to even know that I was Appalachian. To experience the region, we studied Foxfire magazines like those that had lined the bookshelves in my childhood living room. We practiced churning butter. We read about quilting. And some of this resonated with me because it was familiar. My granny painstakingly taught me to quilt one summer, which mostly meant that I spent time watching her pull out all of my sloppy handwork. My granny and pa, who lived next door, canned homegrown tomatoes and green beans. I knew the difference between half runners and blue lakes and know of no sound more satisfying than the pop of lids sealing on the kitchen counter in the late afternoon. But there were plenty of Appalachian traditions that I did not know, and there was nothing markedly Appalachian that we did because we had to. It's true that I had eaten groundhog on camping trips and could name most of the local peaks by sight, but it's also true that I bought incense and spirulina at a health food store in Asheville. I ate more tempeh than I did fat bat, and I loved Ani DeFranco and Doc Watson equally. So after graduation, I moved to Boston and became for the first time an outsider. Like so many before me, it took leaving home to understand it. I felt like Ivy Rowe and Lee Smith's Fair and Tender Ladies, who says that she's like her daddy because she needs a mountain to set her eyes against. So as I was proud of my home in Boston, I was also learning that powerful stereotypes about Appalachia had arrived there before me and had influenced the way that even the most considerate people thought about me. The banjo lick from Deliverance backed many introductory conversations when I said where I was from. Instead of calling people out for their ignorance, I distanced myself from Haywood County. I laughed along. I waited longer and longer to reveal my background. I blended in. During this time, I applied to graduate school. In my visits to prestigious universities in Boston, I actively tried to talk right and hide my accent. But one lingering linguistic marker caused me the most panic when I slipped. Long after I had attached the G's to my gerunds and bleached out the local color from my language, I stumbled over the word O-N. When my mom told me to put my coat on, those words rhymed. She told me to call her when I was on the road, and those words rhymed. To my Appalachian tongue, O-W-N and O-N were pronounced exactly the same way, but not for the rest of the world, I learned. This reminder that I was not from around here meant to me that I might not belong in a Boston graduate school. So I learned to always use adverbs. I took my groceries from a buggy and put them in a cart. I nearly stopped calling my hat a toboggan. I forced my vowels into shape, and it worked. I got into graduate school. I got a PhD. I learned to pass, but I lost my voice. With grannies chiding in my ear, "You're talking uppity now that you live in Boston," I developed a new way of speaking. And it wasn't until a decade later that I heard my own repressed voice echoed back to me in West Virginia. Writer and activist Silas House spoke at a conference addressing the theme of New Appalachia, urging his audience to bring LGBTQ civil rights issues into our classrooms, our scholarship, and our conversations in order to make Appalachia a safer place. New Appalachia for House was tied to old Appalachian activism. As soon as he began speaking, I began to understand the new in light of the old. Combined with quiet thoughtfulness, his manner of speaking awakened in me memories that I had long put to rest. In one moment, his voice cracked as he was overcome with emotion, remembering the violence enacted upon queer youth in Appalachia. Throats tightened across the room. He paused and then said quietly, "And it will go on and on and on until we, the teachers and writers and students in the room, commit to change." Now, to an outsider, it might have sounded like he was saying O-W-N over and over. But when I heard Silas House repeat this word in this context, I felt the ground shift beneath me. Because while he talked about justice, I heard the timbre of my paw. As he read his own poetry, I heard the cadence of my Aunt Betsy. As he addressed his audience, I heard my mom talking. I heard established scholars speak in accents, and it did not change the content of what they were saying. It did not change the power of their intellect. My own had become not my own, and I felt a powerful loss of my own voice and my own accent. Now, I can't change the fact that my granny's great granny was raised as a white girl after her biological parents had to leave her on the Trail of Tears. Passing for white, she had no choice but to assimilate to her surroundings to fit in. I'm unable to trace my way back to that culture that was taken from her and connect to a past that was not allowed to happen. But I can claim the past that I have known. Now that I have learned to articulate issues about representation and gender politics, I want to do so in my own voice, to let my vowels relax into the shape that they wanted to take all along. I want to honor the voices that were the soundtrack to my upbringing and respond to the calls of Uncle Joe, Granny, Aunt Lena, Aunt Betsy, Pa, and Mom. I want to draw thick that perforated line to my past. I want to claim the voices belonging to my people. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you both for sharing that and your different pieces. it must be hard to pick just a few things from this collection because it's deep and wide. What did you all feel like as the pieces began coming in? And how did you put out the word? Tell us that story.
Well, the history of this book is pretty interesting. It began with the Appalachian Studies Conference in 2017, I believe, in Blacksburg. And Hillbilly Elegy had come out the previous year and was just, on the top of the New York bestseller list forever. And also Trump was, using Appalachia as a central part of his political campaign, and it was getting a lot of media attention. And it just seemed like after I read that book, I just couldn't imagine why it was so popular. I mean, I didn't think it was all that engaging, but B, it just seemed to reiterate so many things that we had seen so many times in the construction of Appalachian. So it was kind of an idea of just what did people in the region think about it. And so I put out a call and we had a bunch of people come together. And then later on, and that was really well attended, and the emotion, the intensity of the emotions in the room were really strong. And then West Virginia Press reached out to me and said, did I want to make it into a book, which I hadn't even thought about at that level. And so I began to put things together, and then they also put us in touch. Meredith, you want to tell that part of it?
Yeah, so at the same time, so Tony had been a scholar that I had read and admired, and we had met once at that point. So totally unrelated, someone from West Virginia University Press had also contacted me, the same editor, had contacted me because he read the Southern Cultures piece that I wrote and asked if I wanted to do something more with that. And he asked me if I wanted to expand it into a longer book. And I said, my story is not that unique. A lot of people have the very same experience that I'm talking about here. I'm more interested in doing some sort of collection. I don't think that I need to be the authority on this topic. And so I put out a call for narratives. I was seeking different perspectives around, it started as people navigating voice in academic spaces, people who were from Appalachia, and then it kind of shifted from there. And I had these, and I knew that I wanted to have poetry and narrative. And so I had this great collection had come together, and eventually I ended up calling Andrew, the editor, and said, I have all of these great pieces, but I don't know what holds them together. I don't know what is at the core of these wonderful pieces. Tony, back to you.
So he had the brainstorm to put our two projects together, that each of them were in some ways too limited for themselves, but collectively they redefined both. Both the sort of reactions to Hillbilly Elegy and, not allowing that to define and border our what we were trying to do. And so once we figured it out and, started working together and tag teamed, and it was just one of the most wonderful experiences in my academic career working with Meredith, because we just really blended well. We really played off each other, and we would have situations where we couldn't work and the other one took over. So anyway, that worked just great. And then we thought we would add photography as well. That was the sort of final piece, because, so much of Appalachian imaginations, both good and bad, have been photographic. And so we wanted to speak back against the kind of standard vision of, poor people in black and white looking sad, right? And so so that element was the final piece that we could kind of bring all this together. And then it was just a sea of people who were interested in being part of it, including people I found online who weren't from Appalachia, but grew up in Arkansas and are now in California, but speak very deeply and theoretically to questions of law and poverty in Appalachia and conceptions of white poverty and stuff. So it all just kind of magically came together in really short order, I thought.
Yeah, it happened very quickly. And what's kind of interesting, I think, about the way that our book came together is that I don't think that either of us would have imagined it the way it turned out. It was one of those, the greater than the sum of the two parts, right? Because, and I don't know that before this book that many publishers would have gone for a wonky collection that had scholarship and had narrative and poetry and photography and was, yes, responding to Appalachia, but responding to hillbilly elegy, but doing something beyond that as well. What's exciting is talking with publishers now. I understand that we have let some publishers know that this can work, and it's set. I think it's opened up some possibilities for other collections moving forward.
That's exciting. I think that the different uses for it too, because of both the critical side of it about Vance brings people into the deep discussion of the ways that people, Appalachia has been represented and people have fought those representations. And we've seen book after collection on that too, but then it brings them into this contemporary look of many Appalachians looking at their Appalachia and talking about it too. So I did not know that they had started as two different ones because I didn't know the deeper history of it. And it's just a delight because it's a match made in heaven. Because it does, I think the two pieces end up speaking to each other, and it draws together in my mind a wider vision too, because oftentimes the academics will look more at the academics, the creatives will look more at the creatives. And as we know from the people we work with, the two actually work much more hand in hand with that too. What did the contributors think about finding themselves in a book together?
I think for poetry, it was probably the poets, it was probably the most unusual thing. Like they weren't used to that sort of thing. But I thought and I mean, I think they enjoyed it as well. But I think the scholars, to have it connected to poetry, to have it connected to art, I think really helped them reimagine their projects in some way and reimagine their audiences. I think that was another thing we were hoping for, and I think has succeeded, is that we reach beyond the academy and very much in the Appalachian studies tradition, I think, because I've always been struck by how interdisciplinary, how much it connects with all different levels of academic work, social activists, as well as scholars, as well as artists. And so very much took that as a model of how to put it together.
It was a little, there were a couple of people, because my project, or what started as my project, had nothing to do with Vance directly. Right. There were a couple of writers. So, and I said, hey, this book is changing shape, and this is now what we're working toward. I don't think he'll mind my saying, Robert Geip, who has a great piece in there, he and I had some conversations eventually about it, because he didn't want to be a part of a piece that was responding to Vance. He didn't want to draw more attention to Vance. And so that, I think, the nuance there of, is a book that is a reaction going to actually draw more attention to Vance? That was something that I talked with him about, and a couple of the other poets that didn't see their narratives framed in that context, and they had to kind of grapple with that a little bit. What ended up doing it for everybody, though, and convincing them that it made sense, was seeing the collection all together and realizing that, one of the things, Tony, when he read from the introduction, there's this language about how we didn't want this to just be like some kind of critique of Vance that was just trying to tear him down. And Roger May, who worked with us as one of the photography editors, along with Teresa Burris on the book, when we invited him to be a part of this, we had a long conversation, and what he said was, I just don't want to be a part of something that's mean-spirited.
Right.
And I just remember thinking, yeah, that me either. And luckily, Tony and I were already moving in that direction, and Roger could see that we wanted to have a critical conversation that wasn't aiming to shut anyone down. It was actually aiming to open up conversation. So that's what I think allowed people like Robert Geip to say, yeah, this works.
I can say Robert Geip had a very, let me put, colorful response to being part of something talking about J.D. Vance. So I'm glad we won him over, because he's just a force of nature, and he's just the most hilarious and deep thinking guy I've come across in a long time.
I'm thinking about some of the pieces are not anti-Vance per se, right? Instead, they are thinking about the work, and they're thinking about the moment. Even Michael Maloney's piece, right? And their paths are almost exact, right? But very different paths in the end. But it was very, some pieces do critically situate it in an ideological struggle. Other pieces are that the struggle is much wider than that too, and the thinking is much wider as well with it.
Absolutely, and some are deeply personal, talking about, family members and talking about their experience of being in and outside of Appalachia. And then others are kind of traditional scholarship, looking at, socio-demographic information and polling information and things like that. And I think it works as a collection, and we had a lot of struggles with trying to figure out how to organize it, and how to divide it, and how to make it make sense. But I think it does. And I think if there are any elements of clunkiness in that, that's good too, because life's a mess, and things are complex, and things flow and overflow their banks, and so do our projects.
I think if we had finished this project and felt like, okay, we really got it, we have just written the book on Appalachia, then we would know that we had failed. And that's a question we got. I mean, Tony and I were lucky enough to go on a bit of a book tour with this, and to get to talk to a lot of people about the issues that the book raised. And there was a lot of people wanted us to have simple, clear answers sometimes. And it's disappointing and probably irritating sometimes to hear scholars and thinkers and people who are just paying close attention refuse to give a simple answer, because there just isn't one. There isn't one. There should never be one book on Appalachia.
What I was going to ask about the conversation, some of the conversations that resulted from bringing this book. Like I remember when we were in Asheville at the Appalachian Studies Conference, when there was the big reading, and Meredith, that must have made your heart throb, closer to home with it down there too. But I'm curious about those kinds of conversations. And I know there are many, and there are all kinds of things, but what are some of the ones that come to mind?
I have one for sure that I think of. When we launched the book at West Virginia University,
Yes,
we had Crystal Good, who's a poet and essayist. She has a poem in the collection. Crystal Good was with us, and Roger May, the photographer that we mentioned, was with us. And we did an overview, did some readings, and someone in the audience, the discussions in the audience moved from the book toward talking about the region broadly and generally. And a gentleman in the audience did a thing that happens sometimes, where not so much a question, more of a comment. And what he said just really struck me. He talked about how he had moved to the region, and he loved the region because people were content with so much less, and that they were happy living on really low wages. And this was the week of the teacher strikes in West Virginia. And I just remember, my face kind of turning bright red and trying to respond to him in some way. And I left, and at the end of the conversation, Crystal Good turned to me and she said, "Whew, y'all are going to have fun with this one," or something along those lines. Like, this is going to be tough, these conversations. And what struck me then that was helpful and prepared me for the conversations that we had for the next few months was that there is such a deep investment in a particular image of Appalachia that you can be sitting in front of a group of scholars and artists in a room filled with people at West Virginia University, and you can still you can still state a belief without noticing that there's all of this evidence to the contrary around you, and without attention to like the historical moment of this amazing teacher strike that had just been happening. That helped me understand how deep that investment in a particular story is, and how important it is that we keep getting this book in people's hands. Because I think if they actually read the wide range of perspectives there, it's harder, at least, to hold on to this image that serves you. Remember that, Tony?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely do. I also remember you getting angrier and angrier as you thought about the implications of it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been thinking about how there's been response to more West Virginia than Kentucky, but towards the vaccine rollout and the success of West Virginia in vaccinating its people at a higher rate, and how that then gets spun negatively to reinforce. I saw some joke about, well, that's because they're so used to, essentially the idea was that's because they're so used to shooting up that, vaccination is easy to sell. It was just so ugly. And I thought that just carries on, and the need to push back against these notions is just so strong, And it's not that, I think our book is clear that it's not that the region is without problems. We're not trying to run away from it or just sort of sugarcoat it. And it's not that J.D. Vance's story is not legitimate for himself, but it is that, it's not the only story, right? It's not the one story. And we have to have multiple voices, and we have to put it into a historical, social, economic, and emotional context, if we're going to understand anything and if we're going to move forward successfully.
I think it's important to also just say that, of course, we remember or I'm remembering at least the negative moments where we felt really challenged by the audience. What I also mostly remember is a sense of gratitude that people had a book that they could give to people who said, "I read Hillbilly Elegy and I really understand where you're from." I think so many of us have had that experience and wanted to be able to say, like, no, he doesn't get it fully right. And you can't really, say, well, you need to take this course and read all of these books to complicate it. And so I remember just having people be grateful that there was a book that they could hand and say, "This is why I didn't like Vance. Read this and you'll understand more."
Yeah, and I also heard from a lot of people at book festivals and stuff who were from the region or whose family was from the region but are no longer, but really wanted to have a space where they could personally and with others engage a broader sort of sense of what it is to be Appalachian. They really recognize how unique in some ways, and also how non-unique an experience it is, and how it has shaped their identity and their lives. And they wanted to wrestle with those ideas. So, and that has been very rewarding too. People come up and say, well, my grandmother's from there, and now I can finally have a chance to sort of understand a little more what it's like to be Appalachian, and also outside, both from the inside looking out and the outside looking in.
I think one thing that you're both getting at is the actual complexity of the conversation. Discourse is not a simple room that people enter into, sit at a table and talk hands. There's conversations going on everywhere. And I think that the way that the book came together shows all those conversations, and it's not a conversation. There are many conversations and many directions with it. And I hear you all also talking about taking it on the, so to speak. And part of the great work, I think that, again, watching the proto-fascism in the Trump era is about listening to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And you all are doing, and asking other people to find each other and listen to each other, even though, because we all hold those things we get wrong about one another. So I admire you, your wherewithal and kindness, because it is an act of kindness to do that work too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was always a driving motivation and feeling on both our parts, was to open a conversation, not to close it down, to pass a microphone, not to dictate what needs to be the right way to think about something, and to recognize its complexity, and there's far too little recognition of complexity in the world. So we certainly did want to be part of that.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time together, and I wonder if there's anything else that you all would like to share that comes to mind. If not, I've got another question, but Meredith?
Nothing that comes to mind. I mean, there's so many things I can say, but I'm sort of curious in your question. I don't have any last thing that I feel like
my question is this, that I know when I began a project, let's say I worked on assembling that Cole poetry anthology, I end up thinking I know what's out there, I know what I'm going to find, and I find myself in a very different place on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious about your own transformations in understanding and practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing was nice was the sort of chain of communication that this engendered, that we had at least for my part of the book, I had a few people who I knew I wanted to be part of it, who had been part of the original conference. But then I wanted to make sure that, there were multiple stories from multiple perspectives in terms of gender and race, sexuality, region. Appalachia is a huge place with a lot of different stories. And so, and that often was a chain of, who knows who, and who could speak, who could recommend somebody, looking online and just seeing what's being said about bibliology and just about Appalachia more generally. And so it was a real journey of discovery in that way, I think. And I guess the other thing I would say is I realized the power and the excitement of being an editor, because my main other book was all me, and you're just all alone all the time with your work. But the idea of sort of having an ongoing dialogue with somebody else as you work to craft their voice, give them the chance to make their voice as clear as possible, was quite rewarding as well.
I think that's my biggest takeaway too, Tony, is yes, working with the writers and helping. It's something that as teachers, we've all had an opportunity to do, but working with a writer whose work was going to be published, the stakes felt different. It just felt like such a gift to be working with this caliber of writers and offering feedback, which frankly, it wasn't, I don't think that I had a very strong hand in shaping any of the pieces. The other part of it for me, I had also just finished the book on White, and it had been a pretty, it was interesting and engaging to me, but it was very isolating. And when I think about my experience of writing on White, I think about being in rooms alone. And there was something exciting about that, but it was very lonely. And just the conversations that Tony and I were able to have, and the way that we understood one another and question one another and get energy and give energy, it really was, it made it such an exciting project to be a part of, and it helped me really think differently about the role of collaboration and conversation in learning, which is something that I talk about when I teach, but in my own writing, I hadn't really put it into practice until this experience. So that for me was the most transformative part of it for me.
Well, Meredith, Tony, I want to thank you all so much for taking time to share part of your story, and I want to thank you too for just the quality of the work you're done and continuing to do.
Thank you
Thanks
so
so
much.
much, Chris.
You're welcome.